Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the endocrine system. We'll talk about some glands and the hormones they produce, and we're going to also talk about the negative feedback loops. We're going to talk about steroid hormones. Steroid hormones example would be estrogen, androgens, which is testosterone, cortisol. All of these are considered steroid hormones. Steroids are made inside of our cells, specifically within the organelle known as the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So wherever you have a large amount of steroid hormones being made, you will find a lot of those smooth endoplasmic reticulum organelles within the cell. Steroids are known to be lipophilic, meaning that they do like fats. And so if they like fats, that means they are hydrophobic, meaning that they do not like water. Since they are lipophilic, if this is the plasma, the fluid within the blood vessel right here, and let's say a steroid hormone wants to diffuse into your cell, it is actually going to have an easy time passing through that plasma membrane of the cell right here, because that plasma membrane, that middle portion of the plasma membrane, is made out of lipids. And since steroids are lipophilic, they're going to have an easy time diffusing into the cell. Now, because they are not soluble in water or the plasma, which is mostly made out of water, those steroid hormones, they are usually bound to a bunch of protein carriers, or you can find them bound to proteins found in your plasma, such as albumin. That would help transport them. And that also, when they are bound to those proteins, that helps protect them from any degradation, and that extends also their half-life. But those carrier proteins are lipophobic, meaning they do not like fat. So they're going to have a hard time passing and diffusing into the cell. So when that steroid hormone wants to go ahead and diffuse into the cell, it will have to unbind itself from the protein carrier, and it will go ahead and diffuse easily into the cell. The steroid receptors are either found in the cytoplasm or they're found deep inside of the nucleus. So once the steroid hormone diffuses into the cell, it can either bind, and it will create a complex right here with the receptor in the cytoplasm, or within the nucleus. This receptor steroid complex that gets created right here, usually it will go ahead and bind to the DNA found inside of the nucleus. And when it does that, it's either going to activate or it's going to turn off some of the genes. Now, let's say it goes ahead and binds to the DNA and activates a specific gene within your DNA. Those activated genes are going to start creating new messenger RNA, which will direct the synthesis of new proteins. Now, some of our steroid hormones, they can actually, instead of diffusing directly into the cell and binding to the receptors within your cell, some of them can just bind to some of the receptors found on the surface of the cell. We've talked about some of these receptors on the surface of the cell that are bound to a G protein. So steroid hormones can bind to a G protein coupled receptor. And usually the response that would take place when a steroid hormone binds to those cell surface receptors would be much faster compared to the response you would get by activating a gene. Because when you activate a gene, you have to go through the process of transcription and translation, which is definitely going to take longer. So that's wrapping up, like, this image right here showing you how the steroid hormone binds to which receptor, either inside or outside of the cell. and what happens when it binds to the receptor and then it goes ahead and binds to the DNA, it will lead to the production of a new protein. There are two important glands found in our brain. There is the hypothalamus, and it's connected by that stalk right here to a gland known as the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is such an important gland, even though it is it's really small. It's like the size of a pea, but it's going to control the production and the release of so many hormones that they refer to your pituitary gland as the master gland. Now, because the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary, the hypothalamus is going to be able to send signals either stimulating the pituitary gland or inhibiting the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has two tissues, actually, and so you can divide the pituitary gland into two lobes, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. The anterior pituitary is actually made up of endocrine tissue. So the anterior lobe of the pituitary is going to have the ability to make its own hormones and secrete those hormones. On the other hand, the posterior lobe of the pituitary is actually an extension of the neural tissue of the brain. And so therefore, the posterior lobe of the pituitary is not going to be able to make its own hormones. What it's going to do is it's going to receive the hormones produced by the hypothalamus, and it's going to store it and eventually secrete those hormones out. This image right here shows what's known as a negative feedback loop, how certain hormones, when they are released and a response was achieved, if you are producing too much of that hormone, it can go ahead and act as a negative feedback signal, preventing and stopping the production of certain hormones. But let's go ahead and zoom in on the image before we talk about it so that it's going to be much more clear. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this image right here. So let's say that you were hit by a stimulus. That stimulus could be a variety of things. Let's say that your glucose levels are too low or too high, your calcium levels are too low or too high. And again, there could be a range of different stimuli. Now, some of those stimuli, what they're going to do is they're actually going to stimulate your hypothalamus gland in your brain. When your hypothalamus gland is activated, the hypothalamus will release a hormone. Those hormones are usually known as trophic hormones or tropic. The term tropic hormone means that those are going to be hormones that will control the secretion of some other hormones. So as you can see, once the hypothalamus is activated and it releases that hormone, let's say for now it's called hormone number 1. Hormone number 1 is going to go ahead and stimulate and activate your anterior lobe of your pituitary gland, causing your anterior pituitary gland to produce another tropic hormone, which we're going to go ahead and just refer to it as hormone number 2. Hormone number 2 is going to activate another gland within your body, causing that gland to produce a third hormone. Let's say that this is the last hormone that we are after. This hormone is going to be released and it will bind to the target tissue and we will get the final response that we are after. To give an actual example of, a cascade event like this one, the hypothalamus in your brain right here produces a hormone known as CRH. CRH stands for corticotropin releasing hormone. The corticotropin releasing hormone is going to travel and it's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland, and therefore you can see that since CRH is stimulating your anterior pituitary, it's known as a tropic hormone. Once the anterior pituitary is stimulated, it's going to produce another hormone known as ACTH, or it stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to travel down the bloodstream until it hits this gland right here, found on top of your kidneys, known as the adrenal gland. ACTH is going to stimulate this outer portion of your adrenal gland, known as the adrenal cortex. Once the adrenal cortex is stimulated, it's going to produce a hormone known as cortisol. Cortisol is going to travel down the bloodstream until it hits its target tissue, and you will get the final response that you are after. So for us to get to that final response, notice how many glands got activated. We've activated the hypothalamus, which activated the anterior pituitary, which activated the adrenal cortex. And again, to achieve that final response, several hormones had to be released. CRH by the hypothalamus, which then activated the pituitary to release ACTH, which then activated the adrenal cortex to produce that final hormone, which is the cortisol. Now, cortisol, what is it known for? Cortisol can actually help increase the glucose levels in your blood. It can help break down some proteins, metabolize some fats for energy. It can resist the stressors. So usually when you're stressed out, that's what triggers your cortisol to be released in the first place. But you do not want to have chronic stress. If you are stressed all the time, what's going to happen is that cortisol is going to start depressing and suppressing your immune response. Cortisol is also known to suppress your inflammatory response as well. So let's say that you've achieved a response, and you don't want to keep producing cortisol, as I said, for a very long time. And so what's going to happen? How can that response, how can that pathway right here be stopped? Well, cortisol can actually act as a negative feedback signal. And so we have two types of feedback loops. We have a long feedback loop and we have a short feedback loop. Let's explain first the long feedback loop. So a long feedback loop is where you have a peripheral gland, right, that was kind of pretty far away from your brain, producing a certain hormone. That hormone is going to feed back to suppress the secretion of the anterior pituitary gland, and it can also suppress the secretion of the hypothalamus. So if you stop the production of the hormones produced by the hypothalamus and by the anterior pituitary, well, that gland down here is not going to produce its hormone. And so you stop that hormone production, stopping the response. Another feedback loop is pretty short because it's not traveling as much distance. So the hormone produced by the anterior pituitary itself can go ahead and act as a feedback signal so that it can stop and decrease the hormone secretion by the hypothalamus. So back to our example of our cortisol, let's say our cortisol levels have increased in your bloodstream. You don't want to keep your cortisol levels abnormally high. So what happens when the cortisol levels become very high in your bloodstream, they're actually going to act as a negative feedback signal. So as you can see right here, they're going to act as a negative feedback signal, suppressing the anterior pituitary from producing ACTH. And if you stop the production of ACTH, you basically stop the production of cortisol. Or cortisol can also send a negative feedback loop all the way to the hypothalamus. suppressing the hypothalamus from producing CRH. One more time, you stop producing CRH, then you're going to stop this whole entire cascade event, eventually decreasing the cortisol levels and eventually stopping or decreasing the response. Now, cortisol is usually given to patients that suffer from severe allergies, or it's given to individuals to treat poison ivy, because as we said, cortisol helps decrease your inflammatory response and your immune response. So it makes sense to give it to patients who have allergies or who've just got poisoned. The thing is, if you are taking exogenous cortisol, which means that it's made outside of the body, right? It's a drug that you are taking. So anything outside of the body, we refer to it as exogenous. If you're making your own cortisol, we would refer to it as endogenous. Endo meaning inside, exo outside. So if the exogenous cortisol drug that you are taking, you're taking it every day and it's starting to accumulate within your body, that exogenous cortisol drug can actually act as a negative feedback signal, just as the cortisol produced within your body. So it will act as a negative feedback signal, shutting off the production of ACTH by your anterior pituitary and also shutting off the production of CRH by your hypothalamus, so that it can go ahead and basically depress those levels of these hormones. And so therefore, if the pituitary gland, though, continuously gets suppressed, and eventually, if your pituitary is suppressed, what's going to happen? Your adrenal cortex is also going to be suppressed. So what's going to happen is that your own body will stop making those hormones, to the point that if this keeps going on for a while, then actually the cells of your glands can start to shrink. So one more time, if you are taking cortisol for a pretty long time, that artificial cortisol that you are taking will start sending negative feedback signals, inhibiting your hypothalamus from basically producing CRH and inhibiting your anterior pituitary from producing ACTH. And if you inhibit the hypothalamus and you're inhibiting the anterior pituitary, the adrenal cortex is also going to be inhibited. And so continuous inhibition of those glands, because now they're not working and they're not producing those hormones, what's going to happen is that the cells of your hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary and your adrenal cortex will start to shrink. And that means that over time, those glands are actually going to start losing their ability to manufacture your natural cortisol hormone. And your glands can actually start to shrink and atrophy. So atrophy meaning that your glands will start shrinking. Therefore, after taking a drug for a long time, those glands might be very slow or totally unable to regain back their normal function when the treatment is stopped. Therefore, you would notice that a lot of pills given to patients, especially the ones that can have an effect like this, and it can suppress the production of your own natural hormones because you're taking it in high dosages or you're taking it for a long time. What they try to do is they try to make the patients take like they try to allow the patients to taper off that drug gradually. So they would tell you, okay, take 7 pills the first day, but then by the third day, take 5. By the fourth day, you're taking 4, etc. So when they try to taper off gradually, they're trying to allow your glands to work back up to the normal hormone production levels. Um, Otherwise, as I said, if you're continuously taking a drug for a long time, and then you quickly stop it, your glands are not going to get back to their normal production of that hormone. Now, another way for your body to go ahead and suppress a certain hormone secretion, if that hormone secretion, one more time, is abnormally high and you're producing that hormone for an extended time. First of all, you might be wondering, well, what causes your body to produce a certain hormone in abnormally high levels? Let's say someone has a tumor within that gland, and so you are producing a very high amount of that hormone. One way, other than those feedback loops that we've just talked about, those negative feedback loops, another way your body can go through what's known as down regulation, which we've talked about it previously. And this is where your cells, the target cells, are going to downregulate. They're going to start decreasing the number of the receptors found on their surface. So that those cells would do that in order to diminish their responsiveness to the excessive amount of hormone found in your body. An example is if someone is producing too much insulin in their body, so you have too much insulin in your bloodstream, your cells can actually start down regulating and removing those insulin receptors from the surface of the cells. Why is that bad if you actually go through something like that? Because if your insulin receptors are removed, the patient would actually start showing symptoms of diabetes. So that's why it's pretty important for us not to have high levels of insulin in our bloodstream. Otherwise, your own body will start removing those receptors, and you would start showing symptoms of diabetes.